Okay, in this video I want to talk about toxic honey. It's something that all beekeepers in New Zealand need to be aware of. Some of the honey that's produced in New Zealand can be very toxic to humans. Previous to 1920 we had 30 deaths that we know about where people have eaten New Zealand honey and died afterwards. Fortunately since 1920 we haven't, mainly because of good medical care and some of the regulations that have been brought in to control it. So I'd say before 1920, 30 deaths, and probably in total we know about at least 500 people have been poisoned, and our health stats tell us that for everyone we know about, at least deaths to a particular cause, there's usually about 10 times as many people have actually been killed or poisoned than were reported, because most of it goes unreported, especially in those early days. For a long time we didn't know what was causing it, but what it is there's a plant that we find growing all throughout New Zealand that mainly grows on riverbanks or in disturbed land, and it's called toot. It's very toxic to animals that eat it, but also in New Zealand we've got Skully Popper, which is a little brown flight insect, and you quite often see them in garden plants. If you touch them, the juvenile forms have this little fluffy patch on their abdomen. If you touch them they jump quickly. So those are Skully Popper, and they came from Australia. But what the Skully Popper does is feeds on the toot plants and produces honeydew. Then the bees collect the honeydew, and it's this honeydew that's very, very toxic. So what we have in New Zealand is we have regulations about collecting honey and whether you have to get it tested or not. So if you are harvesting honey in January or later, in all of the North Island and the top half of the South Island, if you're a commercial beekeeper, you must get it tested for tootin. And generally speaking, that happens. All commercial beekeepers do get it tested, but you have to remember to do it. If you're a hobbyist beekeeper, you don't have to get your honey tested. However, well, that's legally. However, you'll obviously get into serious problems if you give honey away and you poison somebody with it. So recommendations for hobbyists also to get their honey tested as well. The test is a little expensive, but what you can do is combine, if you're a hobbyist, combine your honey with somebody else's for the test to check that the levels of tootin in the honey are low enough not to cause a problem. The other thing to remember is that you don't even want to taste honey that you're collecting if you're harvesting it after December, which is when most honey is collected. Because we have stories mainly down from Whakatane where a commercial beekeeper was harvesting the honey. They just put their finger in the honey to taste it and woke up on the floor 2 days later. They managed to poison themselves just with that small amount of honey. So you don't want to, even while you're handling the honey, you don't want to taste it before it gets tested. I know of a commercial beekeeper who really without thinking was having a barbecue, so they brought along a frame of honey for everybody because it's kind of neat to look at and to taste it. But it wasn't until halfway through they realized what risks they were posing, that because it hadn't been tested, anything could have happened. And some of the poisoning incidents we've had have been really graphic. There was a group of school children in a private school in England, and they were all having breakfast, and 10 minutes later half the kids were writhing on the ground underneath the tables, and they had to work out what these kids had eaten and what they hadn't, and they worked out it was honey, and it was New Zealand honey. It came from Tuteko. So not only do we get poisoning, sometimes we get mass poisonings. The last one was about 2006, where a beekeeper was selling honey at the side of the road and poisoned about 13 people, and we were very lucky to pick it up at all. The only reason we found out was that a person turned up in Thames Hospital reporting that they'd had seizures and were misdiagnosed, and then a couple of hours later another person turned up at the Thames Hospital with seizures and misdiagnosed as well. But a nurse actually suddenly realised they were the same family. Put two and two together, they came up with toxic honey, and then did a quick survey of other hospitals, and 13 people had turned up. So Obviously, if we have more poisonings, there's the health risk, but has a big influence on New Zealand honey sales, of course, both in New Zealand and outside if we go and poison people. So the rules are very simple. You can show area freedom. If you're in the middle of Auckland City, there may not be many tuke plants around, but you have to go through the process of checking, because we always have to remember that honeybees have got a foraging area of about 70 square kilometres. So it's not what you see just in your neighbourhood, it's got to be a much larger area that has got to be free. So our best advice is always, if you're a hobbyist, get your honey tested. If you're a commercial beekeeper, you must get it tested.